Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. Picture this. You're looking through old family photos when you notice something disturbing. In every picture from your grandmother's nursing home, there's one less person, and they're disappearing in a very specific order. What would you do if you realized the pattern, and your loved one was next? Before I tell you what happened at Willowbrook Manor, hit that subscribe button. Because after hearing this, you'll want to know if your own family is safe. Trust me on this one. The smell hit me first. Not the antiseptic hospital smell I expected, but something sweeter, like overripe fruit trying to mask decay. I stood in the lobby of Willowbrook Manor Assisted Living, clutching the bouquet of yellow roses Mom always loved, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. "You must be Sarah," the receptionist said. Her smile stretched too wide, like she'd practiced it in a mirror one too many times. "Your mother talks about you constantly. She's in room 237. I signed the visitor log, noticing how thick the book was. How many pages of names, dates, times, all in perfect alphabetical order. Anderson, Avery, Baker. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everyone in that sick greenish glow that made healthy people look half dead. Residents shuffled past in their walkers. Some smiled, some stared at nothing. Normal nursing home stuff, right? Room 237 was at the end of the hall. Mom sat by the window, thinner than last month, staring at the parking lot like it held the secrets of the universe. "Mom?" I pulled up a chair, already knowing this would be one of those visits. Mom's dementia had been getting worse, mixing reality with imagination. Last time, she'd insisted the night staff were stealing her socks. The time before that, she claimed her roommate could walk through walls. "Who's Agnes, Mom?" "Agnes Albright. She lived 3 doors down. Lovely woman. Used to be a teacher in Detroit. We played cards every Tuesday." Mom's fingers twisted the edge of her blanket. "She's gone now." "I'm sorry, Mom. Did she pass away?" Mom's eyes darted to the door, then back to me. She leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. "That's what they want us to think. But Agnes was healthy as a horse last week. Then Monday morning, gone, just like Albert." "Albert?" "Albert Ames. He was here when I moved in 6 months ago. Disappeared 2 weeks after Agnes arrived. Then she lasted exactly 2 weeks. Now she's gone too." Mom grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Sarah, they're taking us alphabetically." I forced a laugh. "Mom, that's just a coincidence. People in nursing homes, they die? Is that what you were going to say?" Her voice turned sharp, lucid in a way that made my skin prickle. "Agnes didn't die, Sarah. None of them died. They just disappeared. And the staff acts like they never existed at all." I spent the next hour trying to redirect the conversation. We talked about my job at the bank, about her grandchildren, about the weather. But Mom kept circling back to Agnes and Albert. By the time I left, unease had settled in my stomach like a cold stone. In the parking lot, I called my brother Tom. "How was she?" he asked, kids screaming in the background. "She has this new fixation. Thinks residents are disappearing in alphabetical order." Tom sighed. "Last month it was poisoned pudding. The month before, mind control through the TV. It's the dementia, Sarah. You know that." I did know that. Of course I did. But as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about that visitor log. All those names in perfect order. All those pages. That night, I dreamed of empty rooms and echoing hallways. Of names being erased from existence, one letter at a time. 3 days later, I couldn't stop thinking about Mom's words. It was eating at me, the way a splinter works deeper into your skin. So I did what any rational person would do. I started researching. Willowbrook Manor's website was all stock photos and comforting phrases. Your loved one's home away from home. Pictures of smiling seniors playing bingo, enjoying meals, doing water aerobics, nothing unusual. But when I searched for reviews, most were standard. 5 stars from guilty family members, 1 star from angry relatives complaining about cold food or rude staff. But buried on the 3rd page of Google, I found something that made my coffee go cold. A blog post from 8 months ago, what happened to my father at Willowbrook. The woman wrote about her dad, Benjamin Bowers, who'd been a resident for 3 years. Healthy, happy, then suddenly gone. The staff claimed he'd been transferred to a medical facility for treatment, but no hospital had any record of him. When she'd pressed for answers, threatened legal action, Willowbrook produced paperwork, transfer documents, medical records, even security footage of him leaving in an ambulance. But something felt wrong to her. The signature on the transfer papers wasn't quite right. The security footage was grainy, the timestamp suspicious. She'd hired a private investigator, but the trail went cold. Benjamin Bowers had simply vanished. The blog had only 1 comment, posted 2 months later. Same thing happened to my aunt, Barbara Banks. They said she moved to live with family in Oregon. I'm her only family. My hands shook as I clicked through more searches, found a Facebook group, Families of Willowbrook. Only 12 members, but their stories made my skin crawl, always the same pattern. Healthy resident, sudden disappearance, official explanation that didn't quite add up. And when I listed the names, Agnes Albright, Albert Ames, Barbara Banks, Benjamin Bowers, Charles Chen, Catherine Clark, alphabetical. Every single one. I called Tom immediately. I need you to look at something. Sarah. Not this again. Just listen, please. I read him the names, the stories, the pattern. The silence on his end stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, this has to be a coincidence, or maybe you're only finding the ones that fit the pattern. Confirmation bias. Then explain why there's no record of David, anyone or Elizabeth anyone, or Frank anyone disappearing from Willowbrook. Only A's, B's, and C's. There has to be an explanation. Mom's name is Dorothy, Tom. Dorothy starts with D. More silence, then I'll meet you there tomorrow, 9 a.m. The next morning, Tom and I sat in Willowbrook's administrative office. The director, Mrs. Hamilton, smiled that same too-wide smile I'd seen on the receptionist. We're concerned about our mother, Tom said, using his lawyer voice. She has some anxieties about other residents. Oh, that's perfectly normal, Mrs. Hamilton assured us. Change can be difficult for our residents. Sometimes they create stories to make sense of their new environment. She specifically mentioned Agnes Albright and Albert Ames, I said, watching her face. Not a flicker. I'm afraid I can't discuss other residents due to privacy laws, but I can assure you Willowbrook maintains the highest standards of care. Could we see your records of resident transfers or deaths for the past year? Tom asked. Just for our peace of mind? Now her smile faltered, just for a second. I'm afraid that information is confidential, but I can assure you, you can assure us of nothing, I interrupted. We'd like to see the visitor log. That's public, isn't it? Mrs. Hamilton's fingers drummed on her desk. Tap, tap, tap. The visitor log is for security purposes only. I'm sure you understand. We left with nothing but platitudes and promises that Mom was receiving excellent care. In the parking lot, Tom looked shaken. She's hiding something, he said. You believe me now? I believe something's wrong, but what are we supposed to do? Call the police? Tell them we think a nursing home is disappearing residents alphabetically. They'll think we're crazy. He was right. We had no proof, just a pattern and a feeling. But as we drove away, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A van pulling out of Willowbrook's service entrance. White, unmarked, windows tinted black. It followed us for 3 blocks before turning off. Probably nothing, I told myself. Probably. 2 weeks passed. I visited Mom every other day, watching for signs, counting residents, learning names. Dennis Davenport in room 242 loved to tell stories about his time in the Navy. Donna Dixon in 218 painted watercolors of birds. Douglas Dunn, Daniel Diaz, Deborah Dunham. So many D names, so many potential victims. Mom grew more agitated with each visit. She'd stopped going to activities, stopped eating in the dining room. "I won't make it easy for them," she'd whisper. "If they want Dorothy Palmer, they'll have to come get me." Then, on a Thursday morning, Dennis Davenport was gone. Transferred to hospice, the staff explained. But Dennis had been telling me about his grandson's upcoming wedding just 2 days before. Making plans, excited about life. I drove to every hospice within 50 miles. No Dennis Davenport, no record of any transfer from Willowbrook. That night, I broke into Willowbrook? Okay, broke in might be dramatic. I signed in as a visitor at 8:47 p.m., 15 minutes before visiting hours ended. Then I hid in a supply closet, watched through the crack as the night staff made their rounds. Waited until the hallways went quiet. The administrative office was locked, but I'd learned a thing or two from YouTube. The lock was old, simple. It took me 20 minutes and a hairpin, but I got in. The files were meticulous, organized, too organized. Each resident had a folder, thick with medical records, intake forms, insurance information. I found Dennis Davenport's file. The last entry was dated yesterday. Transferred to Serenity Hospice Center, family notified. But Dennis had no family. He told me that himself, laughing about being a stubborn old bachelor. I photographed everything, then moved to the next cabinet. Found Agnes Albright, Albert Ames, all of them. Every file ended the same way. Transfer. Family notified. Case closed. Then I found something that made my blood freeze. A separate filing system. Color-coded folders. Red for A's, orange for B's, yellow for C's, green for D's. Inside each folder, lists, names, room numbers, dates, and next to each date a single word. Completed. Dorothy Palmer's name was on the green list. The date next to it, tomorrow. I grabbed the folders, shoving them into my bag. Evidence, finally, real evidence. I turned to leave and found Mrs. Hamilton standing in the doorway. "Sarah," she said, voice calm as still water, "you really shouldn't be here." I ran, pushed past her, down the hall, past the startled night nurse. Behind me, footsteps, multiple sets. They were coming. I burst through the emergency exit, alarms screaming. Made it to my car, hands shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice. In the mirror, I saw them. 3 men in white uniforms standing at the door. Watching. Not chasing. Just watching. I drove home like a madwoman. Called Tom. Called the police. Uploaded the photos to cloud storage. Emailed them to myself, to Tom, to 3 different news stations. "We need to get Mom out," I told Tom. "Tonight, now." The police said they'd send someone in the morning. There won't be a morning, not for Mom. But Tom was 40 minutes away, and when I got back to Willowbrook, the night staff wouldn't let me in. Visiting hours are over, they said. Professional. Polite. Immovable. I spent the night in my car in the parking lot. Watching. Waiting. Saw that same white van pull up around 3 a.m. Saw them wheel out a gurney covered in a white sheet. The form underneath, small, frail. Mom sized. The police found nothing. Oh, they investigated. Took my photos seriously enough to get a warrant. But by the time they arrived at Willowbrook the next morning, it was like walking into a different universe. The color-coded files I'd photographed? Gone. Vanished like they'd never existed. The filing cabinet that had held them now contained nothing but standard medical supplies inventory. Boxes of gloves, gauze, normal things. "Ma'am," Detective Morrison said, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for people he thought were having a breakdown. "We've gone through everything. Your mother's transfer papers are all in order. Look, here's the signature from the receiving facility." I stared at the paper he handed me. Serenity Gardens Medical Center, a place I'd never heard of. The signature at the bottom, supposed to be Mom's, was close, too close. Someone had practiced her handwriting, studied it, but they'd gotten the way she curved her Y wrong. Mom had taught third grade for 30 years. She had very specific ideas about proper letter formation. "This isn't her signature," I insisted. "Look at the Y, she never—" "Signatures can change," the detective interrupted. "Especially with elderly patients. Arthritis, tremors, confusion. I've seen it happen with my own mother." Mrs. Hamilton appeared then, dressed in a crisp blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She expressed deep concern about my break-in, but graciously decided not to press charges, understanding the stress of having a loved one in memory care. "We know this is difficult," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. "Perhaps you'd like to speak with our counselor? Grief can manifest in many ways, including paranoid ideation." Paranoid ideation. She was already building a narrative. Unstable daughter, overwhelming grief, breaking and entering. Who would believe me now? I hired a private investigator with my savings. Marcus Freeman came recommended, ex-FBI, the kind who didn't mind bending rules. He listened to my story without interrupting, examined the evidence, then named a price that made my stomach drop. "I can give you half now," I said. "The rest when you find something." Marcus studied me for a long moment. "Your mother?" I nodded. "I'll take the case. Pay me when you can." 2 weeks later, Marcus called. "We need to meet, not your place, not mine. You know Forest Park, the picnic area by the lake?" An hour later, I sat across from him at a weathered wooden table. He looked tired, worn, like whatever he'd found had aged him years and days. "Your mother is alive," he said without preamble. "At least, she was 3 days ago." The world tilted. I gripped the table. "How? Where?" "A medical research facility 3 states away. Sky Industries. On paper, they develop treatments for age-related diseases, but their funding doesn't match their output. Millions in grants, minimal published research." Marcus laid out surveillance photos. "I tracked the white vans. They go to Sky. Every transfer from Willowbrook ends up there. But here's where it gets strange." He pulled out more photos. "These are Sky's researchers. Run them through facial recognition. Half of them used to be residents at various nursing homes, including Willowbrook." I stared at the images. Elderly people in lab coats, walking purposefully, working at computers. One of them, "Oh my God, that's Agnes Albright, Mom's friend. She's supposed to be dead." "Not dead, changed. Look closer." I did. Agnes looked different. Younger wasn't the right word, sharper, more focused. Like someone had turned up the contrast on her entire being. What are they doing to them? Marcus pulled out internal documents. "Near as I can tell, Sky Industries isn't developing treatments for age-related cognitive decline. They're studying it, using it. They believe that dementia, Alzheimer's, these conditions don't destroy the mind. They reveal something underneath, something that normal cognitive function suppresses. That's insane." "Is it?" Think about it. Savant syndrome. People who suffer brain injuries and suddenly can play piano or speak languages they never learned. What if dementia works similarly? What if it doesn't take away but transforms? That night, the phone rang. Unknown number. Ms. Palmer? A woman's voice, professional, calm. This is Dr. Elizabeth Kane from Sky Industries. I believe we should talk. My blood went cold. How did you get this number? The same way you got our name. Research, investigation, following patterns. We're not so different, you and I, both looking for answers. Both trying to help the people we care about. You kidnapped my mother. We offered her an opportunity, one that her advancing condition made her uniquely qualified for. But I understand your concern, that's why I'm calling, to invite you to visit. See for yourself what we do here. Speak with Dorothy, if she wishes to speak with you. If? Miss Palmer, what do you know about the ship of Theseus? The philosophical question caught me off guard. If you replace every part of a ship, is it still the same ship? Exactly. Your mother is here. But the woman you knew, the teacher who raised you, graded papers at the kitchen table, made cookies for bake sales, that woman was already fading. Dementia was taking her piece by piece. We simply guided the reconstruction. Into what? Into something extraordinary. Come see for yourself. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., I'll have a pass waiting at the gate. Building C rose before me like a glass and steel mountain. Modern, clean, nothing like the Gothic horror I'd imagined. The blue line on the floor led through automatic doors into a lobby that belonged in a tech startup. Plants, natural light, even a coffee bar. Miss Palmer, Dr. Elizabeth Kane, stood by the elevators. Younger than her voice suggested, maybe 40, sharp eyes behind designer glasses. Thank you for coming. She didn't offer her hand, didn't smile. Just gestured for me to follow. The elevator rose silently. 3rd floor, 4th, 5th. Each floor we passed showed glimpses of laboratories, clean rooms, people in white coats bent over computers or complex equipment. Normal, mundane, nothing sinister. You're wondering where the horror is, Durkane said. The cages, the screaming victims. Sorry to disappoint. Where's my mother? Patience. First, context. Do you know what sundowning is? I nodded. When dementia patients get agitated in the evening. Exactly. But do you know why it happens? As daylight fades, the brain struggles to maintain its constructed reality. The walls between conscious and unconscious thought become thin. Dementia patients don't get confused. They see too clearly. See multiple realities simultaneously. Past, present, possible futures. Medicine calls it confusion. We call it expanded perception. The elevator stopped at the 8th floor. The doors opened to reveal a different world. Warm colors, soft lighting, music drifting from somewhere. It looked like an upscale apartment building. Welcome to the transition wing, Dr. Kane said. This is where our participants live during the process. Would you like to see Agnes Albright first? I believe she and your mother were friends. My heart hammered. She's here? Room 803. Fair warning, she may not be what you expect. We walked down a hallway that smelled like vanilla and old books, nothing medical about it. Dr. Kane knocked on a door marked with a small brass nameplate. A. Albright. Come in. The voice was Agnes's, but different, clearer. We entered a studio apartment. Bookshelves lined the walls. A desk covered in papers sat by the window, and there, in a reading chair, sat Agnes Albright. Alive, alert, but changed. Sarah Palmer, she said before I could speak. Dorothy's daughter. You have her eyes, also her stubbornness judging by your presence here. Agnes, what did they do to you? She laughed. a young sound from an old throat. Do. They offered me a choice. Continue dissolving into nothing, memories scattered like leaves, or become something new. I chose transformation. Through what? Drugs? Surgery? Through understanding. Agnes stood, moved to her desk with surprising grace. Look at this. My work. The papers were covered in equations. Complex mathematical formulas that hurt to look at. Diagrams that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I was a third-grade teacher, Agnes continued. Basic arithmetic was my limit. Now, I'm working on a unified theory of consciousness. The dementia didn't take my mind. It revealed capabilities I never knew existed. Layers of thought, dimensions of reasoning, all locked away by the limitations of normal cognition. That's not possible, isn't it? Dr. Kane interjected. The human brain uses only a fraction of its potential. Various conditions can unlock hidden capabilities. Acquired savant syndrome, hyperthymesia. We simply found a way to guide the unlocking. By kidnapping nursing home residents? By offering them an alternative to oblivion, Agnes said sharply. Do you know what dementia feels like from the inside? It's not peaceful confusion, it's terror, watching yourself disappear piece by piece, knowing what's coming but powerless to stop it. They offered us a different path. Where is she? Where's my mother? Agnes and Dr. Kane exchanged glances. She's in the garden, Agnes said softly. But Sarah, she's deep in transition. She may not acknowledge you. The garden was on the roof, enclosed in glass. Tropical plants created a green maze. Fountains bubbled. Birds sang. And there, sitting on a bench, writing in a notebook, was Mom. But not Mom. The woman wore my mother's face. Had her gray hair, though longer now, her hands, her wedding ring. But everything else was wrong. The way she sat, the intensity of her focus, the slight smile that played on her lips as she wrote. Mom? She looked up. Through me, past me. Her eyes were bright, clear. But they didn't see her daughter. They saw something else. The patterns are clearer today, she said to no one. The mathematical foundations of memory, how they spiral, Fibonacci sequences in the folds of thought. I should document this. She returned to her notebook, writing in symbols I didn't recognize. It's stage 3, Dr. Kane explained quietly. Deep reconstruction. She's rebuilding her cognitive framework from the ground up. In a few weeks, she'll stabilize, integrate her old self with her new capabilities. And if I took her home now, the process would collapse. Without the supporting medications, the guided therapy, she'd experience catastrophic cognitive failure. Not dementia. Complete neural breakdown. I watched my mother write her impossible equations, saw the peace on her face, the purpose. She looked happier than she had in years. Can I stay with her, just for a while? Dr. Kane checked her watch. 1 hour, then you need to decide. Decide what? Whether to leave her here to complete her transformation, or exercise your legal authority as her medical proxy to end the treatment. Force us to return her to a traditional care facility, where she'll fade away like she was always going to. She left me alone with the stranger who wore my mother's face. I sat beside her on the bench. She didn't acknowledge me, just kept writing, occasionally humming. A song I recognized from my childhood. The same tune she'd hummed while cooking dinner, doing laundry, living her small, beautiful life. I'm scared, Mom, I whispered. I don't know what's right. Don't know if this is saving you or stealing you. Don't know if I'm supposed to fight for who you were or accept who you're becoming. She paused in her writing, turned to look at me. For just a moment I saw recognition flicker. Sarah. Her voice was distant, confused. Is it Sunday already? Did you bring the children? No, Mom, It's just me. Oh, she blinked. The moment passed. Her eyes went distant again. The patterns are beautiful today. Would you like to see? She showed me her notebook. The symbols meant nothing to me, but she explained them with such joy, such wonder, like a child discovering the ocean for the first time. When Dr. Kane returned, I knew my answer. How long until she stabilizes? 6 to 8 weeks. You can visit, watch the process, make sure we're treating her well. And then she'll be one of us, a researcher, a pioneer, exploring dimensions of thought we can barely imagine. She'll remember you, love you, but she won't be the woman who taught 3rd grade and baked cookies for PTA meetings. Epilogue. 3 months later. I visit every week now. Watch my mother become something new. She knows me most days, calls me by name, asks about my life. But she also talks about dimensions I can't see, mathematics I can't understand, beauty I can't perceive. Tom thinks I've been brainwashed. Maybe I have, but I've also seen Agnes's research bear fruit. Treatments for cognitive decline that actually work. Understanding of consciousness that pushes the boundaries of neuroscience, all developed by minds that medicine said were dying. Willowbrook still operates, still takes residents alphabetically, but now I know why. They're not stealing our elderly, they're recruiting them, offering them a chance to become something more than human. They approached me last week. Dr. Kane, Mrs. Hamilton, even Agnes, made their pitch in a conference room at Sky. You have the markers, Mrs. Hamilton explained, showing me brain scans taken during my visits. Genetic predisposition to cognitive flexibility, the same patterns we see in our most successful transitions. They gave me time to think. No pressure, no coercion, just an open door to a different future. Mom asked me yesterday during one of her clear moments if I was happy, really happy, living my small life, working at the bank, coming home to an empty apartment. There's so much more, she said, so much beauty you can't see, connections you can't make, thoughts you can't think. Not yet. Not yet, the words echo. Tempt. Promise. So I'm putting this story out there, not as a warning anymore, but as a question. If you could transcend your own limitations, would you? If you could see beyond the veil of normal consciousness, would you look? If you could become something more than human, would you change? The choice is coming, for all of us, sooner than we think. Willowbrook is still taking residence, alphabetically, carefully, with purpose. And somewhere in a garden of impossible thoughts, my mother is writing equations that will change the world. She's happy. Isn't that what matters? The patterns are there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for eyes that can see them. And once you start looking, you can't stop. You won't want to. Trust me. I know. If this story made you think, hit subscribe to explore more questions about consciousness, identity, and what it means to be human. Share it with someone who isn't afraid to question reality, and comment below. Would you make the choice? Would you transform? Because the patterns are everywhere, once you know how to look. Story number 2. The chalk was still warm when they found the empty classroom. I know because I touched it. The white stub rolled between my fingers, leaving dusty residue that felt wrong somehow, like it had been gripped too tightly, like whoever held it last had been trying to write something important, something urgent, before they simply vanished. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what really happened at Riverside High School that October afternoon. And before you click away thinking this is just another creepypasta, I was there. I saw the locked door. I heard the screams that weren't quite screams, and I know why they're covering it up. My therapist says I should talk about it, says it might help with the nightmares. The way I wake up at 3:47 a.m. every single night. Exactly 3:47, with chalk dust under my fingernails that wasn't there when I went to bed. So, here it is, the whole truth. And when you're done listening, when you're lying there in the dark wondering if any of it could be real, remember that I warned you. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some equations aren't meant to be solved. And some teachers never really leave their classrooms. The story begins now. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'd been substitute teaching at Riverside High for exactly 3 weeks when Ms. Peterson disappeared. 3 weeks of navigating teenage eye rolls, forgotten homework excuses, and that particular brand of chaos that only comes from American high schools in the fall. I'd taken the job out of desperation, really. My freelance writing wasn't paying the bills, and substitute teaching seemed like easy money. Show up, take attendance, play a movie. How hard could it be? That's what I thought as I drove through small-town Connecticut that October morning, past the Dunkin' Donuts where cops gathered like moths to fluorescent light, past the veterinary clinic with the broken neon sign that had been flashing Vet Rien Rye for 3 years. October 15th started like any other Tuesday. I grabbed my usual vanilla latte from the corner Starbucks, watched the barista spell my name wrong again, S-A-R-A, no H, and sat in my car for a minute, psyching myself up. Today, I was covering for Mr. Davidson's sophomore English class, Romeo and Juliet. I could handle Shakespeare. The parking lot was mostly empty when I pulled in at 6:45. Just a few cars scattered like islands in an asphalt sea, but Miss Peterson's silver Honda was already there, parked in Space 47, like always. That was strange because she taught AP Chemistry 3rd period, and Linda Peterson was famous for rolling in exactly 3 minutes before the first bell. She had it down to a science, pun intended. I grabbed my tote bag, the one with the coffee stain shaped like Florida on the side, and headed for the main entrance. The October air had that quality that only exists in New England. Crisp enough to wake you up with that underlying smell of decomposing leaves that somehow manages to be both pleasant and unsettling. The maples lining the walkway were showing off that year, all crimson and gold against the gray sky. Beautiful enough to make you forget that winter was coming. Beautiful enough to make you forget that sometimes things hide in the spaces between seasons. The main hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and teenage anxiety, that unique cocktail of Axe body spray, cafeteria pizza, and exam stress. I nodded to Jim, the head custodian, who was mopping near the trophy case. He was always there in the mornings, pushing that same gray mop in the same slow circles. "Morning, Jim." He didn't look up, just kept pushing that mop in slow, methodical circles. The water in his bucket was murky, almost black. I remember thinking that was odd too, but I was running late for morning announcements. Had to sign in at the main office, get my substitute folder, pretend I knew what I was doing. The secretary, Mrs. Kowalski, barely glanced up from her computer. "Room 114. Lesson plans are on the desk. Good luck." She said that last part like I was heading into battle. Maybe I was. But first, I needed to use the restroom. Too much coffee, nervous bladder. The nearest one was on the 2nd floor, which meant passing through the science wing. That's when I heard it. Room 237 was on the 2nd floor, end of the science wing. As I climbed the stairs, I heard it. A sound like chalk on blackboard, but rhythmic. Deliberate, scratch, 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 pause, scratch, scratch, scratch. The hallway was empty. Of course it was empty. Students wouldn't arrive for another hour. But the fluorescent lights were flickering in that way that makes everything feel like a horror movie. You know what I mean? That stuttering brightness that turns shadows into living things. One of the tubes was dying, making this awful buzzing sound like a wasp trapped in a jar. The scratching got louder as I approached room 237, Miss Peterson's room. I knew because she'd decorated her door with periodic table jokes. I tell bad chemistry jokes because all the good ones are gone. That kind of thing. Teacher humor. But the jokes looked different in the flickering light. The letters seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The door was closed, but I could see light bleeding out from underneath. Not the harsh white of overhead fluorescence, but something softer, warmer, like candlelight. And the scratching. God, the scratching. It had a rhythm now, almost like a heartbeat, or breathing. I knocked. "Linda, you okay in there?" The scratching stopped. I waited, counted to 10 Mississippi in my head, then knocked again. "Linda, it's Sarah, from the English department. We met at the faculty meeting last week." Nothing. But then I heard something that made my skin prickle. Whispering. Not words exactly, but something like words. Like someone trying to speak a language that human mouths weren't designed for. And underneath it, so faint I might have imagined it, the sound of chalk rolling across the floor. Here's the thing about teacher etiquette. You don't just barge into another teacher's classroom. It's an unspoken rule. Their room is their domain. But something felt wrong. The air tasted metallic, like pennies on your tongue, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. My breath came out in little puffs of vapor. I tried the handle, locked, but I could still see that warm light shifting under the door, moving, like someone was walking back and forth in front of it. And then I heard her voice, Ms. Peterson's voice, but different, strained, like she was talking through water, or from very far away, or from somewhere that wasn't quite here. The equation must balance, must. Her voice multiplied, echoed, like a dozen Linda Petersons speaking in unison. Some voices were ahead, some behind, creating this awful chorus of desperation. Click. The door unlocked from the inside. I should have run. Every horror movie I'd ever seen, every survival instinct encoded in my DNA, screamed at me to turn around and walk away. But I didn't. Because teachers look out for each other. Because Linda Peterson had been kind to me at that faculty meeting, had shown me where they kept the good coffee in the teacher's lounge. Because I'm an idiot. I pushed the door open slowly, so slowly. And the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong for a chemistry classroom. It smelled like old paper and copper and something else. Something organic. Like mushrooms growing in dark places, like secrets fermenting in forgotten corners. The room was empty. I mean, completely, impossibly empty. Miss Peterson wasn't there. But the chalkboard, God, the chalkboard, it was covered edge to edge with equations, not chemistry equations. At least, not any chemistry I recognized. The symbols seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Mathematical impossibilities that made my eyes water. Some of the symbols weren't even mathematical. They were shapes that hurt to perceive, angles that didn't exist in three-dimensional space. The warm light I'd seen? Gone. Just the standard fluorescence buzzing overhead, casting everything in that sick institutional glow. But on Miss Peterson's desk, centered perfectly like an offering, was a single piece of chalk. Still rolling slightly, still warm when I picked it up. That was my first mistake. Touching it. The moment my fingers closed around that little white cylinder, I felt something shift in my brain, like a door opening in a room I didn't know existed. And through that door came understanding. Just a trickle at first. A whisper of comprehension about what those symbols on the board meant. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to back out of that room and pretend I'd never been there. But I noticed something else. The windows, all of them, were painted black from the inside. Fresh paint. I could smell it now, mixing with that mushroom scent. and in the corner where Ms. Peterson kept her periodic table poster, someone had drawn something else. A diagram that looked almost like a door, but wrong. The angles didn't make sense. Looking at it made my teeth ache. There were other things too, small details that didn't register at first but that haunt me now. The clock on the wall was running backwards. The student desks were arranged in a pattern that resembled one of the equations on the board. And in the trash can. Christ, the trash can was full of chalk. Hundreds of pieces, all worn down to nubs, all covered in fingerprints that looked stretched. Like whoever had been holding them had been pulled away mid-stroke. Sarah? I jumped. Actually jumped, and spun around. Principal Martinez stood in the doorway, his usually perfect tie slightly askew. Behind him stood Vice Principal Roberts, the school resource officer, and was that the superintendent? At 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. Tom, Miss Peterson, she was just here, but he stepped into the room, and I watched his face change. The color drained out like someone had pulled a plug. His eyes tracked across the equations on the board, and his hand went to his throat. I saw him mouth something. A prayer, a curse. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "We need to leave," he said. "Now." But what about Linda? She was just, "Now, Sarah." I'd never heard him use that tone. Tom Martinez was the kind of principal who solved everything with a smile and a dad joke, who wore goofy ties on Fridays and knew every student's name. This was different. This was fear. We left the room, and he locked it behind us. Used his master key, and then, this is the part that still makes my hands shake. He took out a roll of duct tape from his pocket and sealed the edges of the door. All the way around. Like he was trying to keep something in. His hands were shaking so badly that Roberts had to help him with the last corner. "Tom, what's going on?" He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I saw that he'd aged 10 years in the last 30 seconds. There were lines around his eyes I'd never noticed before. Or maybe they were new. Maybe they'd just appeared, carved by whatever he'd seen in that room. "Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully. Miss Peterson called in sick today. She's been home with the flu since yesterday. Whatever you saw in that room, whatever you think you heard, it wasn't her. But her car isn't in the parking lot. I just checked." My vanilla latte turned to acid in my stomach. "Tom, I saw it. The silver Honda, Space 47 like always." He shook his head slowly. "Space 47 has been empty all morning. Jim confirmed it when he did his morning rounds at 6:30. But Jim had been mopping. Jim had seen me, hadn't he? I tried to remember if he'd actually acknowledged my greeting, but the memory felt slippery. Like trying to hold water. Like trying to remember a dream after waking. "I think I need to sit down," I said. Tom guided me to the teacher's lounge, his hand on my elbow like I might collapse. Maybe I would have. The world felt tilted wrong, like when you stand up too fast and all the blood rushes from your head, like gravity had shifted a few degrees to the left. The teacher's lounge was supposed to be a safe space. Motivational posters, mismatched furniture, the eternal pot of coffee that no one admitted to making but everyone drank from. But even here, things felt off. The inspirational quotes on the walls seemed threatening now. "Reach for the stars" took on a whole new meaning when you'd just seen math that suggested the stars might reach back. He poured me a cup of coffee. Terrible teacher's lounge coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and broken dreams, and sat across from me. The morning sun was starting to stream through the windows, painting everything in normal, rational light. But I could still smell that mushroom scent on my clothes. Could still feel the weight of the chalk in my pocket. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did you touch anything in that room?" The chalk, the piece of chalk was in my pocket, still warm against my hip. I could feel it through the fabric, pulsing like a tiny heart. like it was alive, like it was waiting. "No," I lied. "I just looked inside and then you showed up." He studied my face, and I forced myself to meet his eyes. Whatever was happening, I knew instinctively that admitting to taking that chalk would be bad. Very bad. There was something in his expression, a desperate hope that I was telling the truth, that I hadn't made the same mistake as who? How many others had there been? "Good," he said finally. "That's good. Now, I'm going to need you to take the day off. Go home, rest. And Sarah, don't mention this to anyone. Not the other teachers, not your friends, no one. We have a situation that needs to be handled delicately." "What kind of situation?" He stood up, straightening his tie. Back to professional mode, but I could see the cracks in his composure, the way his hands still trembled, the way he kept glancing at the door like something might come through it. "The kind that's above both our pay grades. Someone will be in touch. Tom, go home, Sarah. Please. For your own safety, go home and forget this happened." But how could I forget? How could I forget the sound of Linda Peterson's voice speaking impossible words? How could I forget the equations that even now were starting to make a terrible kind of sense in the back of my mind? I didn't go home. I know, in horror movies. That's when you yell at the screen. But I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to find them. The town library was only 3 blocks from Riverside High, housed in a converted Victorian mansion that had been donated by some long-dead industrial baron. The kind of building that had secret passages and histories darker than its wood paneling. I sat in my car for a moment, engine running, debating. The rational part of my brain, the part that had once written clickbait articles about celebrity divorces and 10 ways to know he's into you, told me to drive home, pour a glass of wine, and pretend this was all a stress dream. But the chalk in my pocket was whispering. Not literally, not exactly. But I could feel it pulling me toward what? Understanding? Madness? Was there a difference? Margaret Hensley had been the head librarian since before I was born. If anyone knew the history of Riverside High, the real history, it would be her. She was one of those small-town fixtures who seemed to exist outside of time, always there, always watching, always knowing more than she said. I found her in the genealogy section, surrounded by towers of old newspapers and yellowed documents. The October morning light slanted through tall windows, highlighting dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts. She looked up when I approached, and her expression shifted from pleasant to guarded in an instant. "Sarah Chen, shouldn't you be at school?" "Margaret, I need to ask you about room 237. She went very still. The kind of still that tells you everything you need to know. Her hands, which had been sorting through index cards with practiced efficiency, froze mid-motion. Behind her, the grandfather clock that had been ticking steadily for over a century seemed to skip a beat. "I don't know what you mean. Please. Something happened this morning. Miss Peterson, Linda Peterson, is home with the flu." Her voice was flat, mechanical, rehearsed, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized long ago. I pulled out the piece of chalk. I hadn't meant to, but suddenly it was in my hand, still warm, still impossible. Margaret's eyes locked onto it, and she made a sound, half gasp, half moan. The sound of recognition. The sound of old fear renewed. "Oh, child, what have you done?" I found it, in the empty classroom. But Miss Peterson was there, I heard her, and then she wasn't. And Principal Martinez sealed the door, and shh. Margaret stood, moving faster than any 70-year-old should be able to. She locked the library door and flipped the sign to closed. Her movements were practiced, efficient. How many times had she done this before? "Come with me, quickly." She led me to the basement archives, past rows of moldering books and forgotten town records. The stairs creaked under our weight, each step down feeling like a descent into something older and darker than the library above. The air got thicker the deeper we went, until breathing felt like work. The fluorescent lights down here were different, older, and they cast shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Finally, she stopped at a filing cabinet that looked older than the building itself. Rust had eaten through parts of it, leaving holes that looked disturbingly organic, like something had chewed through the metal. Riverside High was built in 1952, she said, pulling out a manila folder with hands that shook slightly. But the land is much older. There was a school here before, a one-room schoolhouse that served the farming community. She spread out old photographs on a dusty table, sepia-toned images of stern-faced children and a woman in a high-collared dress. The teacher, presumably. But there was something wrong with the photos. The woman's face was blurred? No, not blurred. It was like she was in motion while everything else was still, like she was vibrating at a frequency the camera couldn't quite capture. October 15th, 1894. That's when it happened the first time. Teacher named Elizabeth Blackwood. She was conducting a lesson when she simply ceased. Not died, not disappeared. Ceased. The children said she was writing an equation on the board, something about balancing, and then she was gone. Door locked from the inside, windows painted black. My hand tightened around the chalk. The first time? Margaret pulled out more documents. Newspaper clippings, police reports, school board minutes. Each one carefully preserved in plastic sleeves like evidence of a crime that kept repeating. 1923, 1947, 1971, 1995, always October 15th, always a teacher, always room 237, or whatever that space was called at the time, and always, she pointed to a detail in one of the reports, always someone finds a piece of chalk. I studied the documents. The patterns were there, hidden in the bureaucratic language. Teacher absent without leave. Classroom sealed pending investigation. Substitute reports unusual mathematical notations. And then, always a few days later, another disappearance. The person who found the chalk. What happens to them? The people who find the chalk. She looked at me with such sadness. They try to balance the equation. I don't understand. Neither did they. But they all reported the same thing in the days that followed. An obsession with solving something unsolvable. With making the numbers work. With opening a door that should stay closed. She gestured to the documents. Mrs. Blackwood was the first. She tried to teach something that shouldn't be taught. Tried to show her students a truth that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. And when she succeeded, when she finally balanced that impossible equation, reality couldn't hold her anymore. That's insane. Is it? You heard her voice, didn't you? Miss Peterson. Still trying to balance it. Still trying to solve what Mrs. Blackwood started. Margaret leaned forward. The chalk, Sarah. It remembers. It wants to complete the lesson. I dropped it then, let it clatter to the floor. But I could still feel its warmth, like phantom heat in my palm. And worse, the equations from the board were becoming clearer in my mind. Not making sense exactly, but making a kind of sense. The kind that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to some older part of the brain. What do? You resist? You go home. You lock your doors. And whatever you do, whatever whispers you hear or numbers you see, you do not try to solve the equation. But what if I can't help it? What if... Margaret grabbed my wrists, her grip surprisingly strong. Listen to me. My grandmother was a student in that schoolhouse in 1894. She saw what happened. She spent the rest of her life documenting it, trying to understand. But understanding is the trap. The equation isn't math, Sarah. It's a virus, a cognitive virus that spreads through comprehension. The more you understand, the less you exist in this reality. She released me and pulled out one final photograph. It was recent, digital, printed on computer paper. It showed room 237 as I'd seen it that morning, covered in equations. But in this photo, there were shadows. Human-shaped shadows standing at the board, overlapping, writing. So many shadows. "They're all still there," Margaret whispered. "Every teacher who balanced the equation, existing in the spaces between numbers, teaching lessons to students who aren't there, and they're waiting for someone else to join them, to help them finish what can never be finished." I reached for the chalk. No, I didn't reach. My hand moved on its own. Margaret slapped it away. Leave it and run. And Sarah, don't come back to the library. Don't look for more answers. The only answer is madness." But it was already too late, because I could see it now in my mind's eye. The first part of the equation. X equals the square root of impossibility. Y equals the diameter of nowhere. And when you solved for Z, I tried, God help me, I tried to resist. I went home to my little apartment above the bakery on Main Street. The smell of fresh bread usually comforted me, but that day it just reminded me of warmth, and warmth reminded me of the chalk, and the chalk reminded me of the equations that were now crawling across the inside of my eyelids every time I blinked. Locked the door, drew the curtains, turned on every light to banish the shadows. But the chalk... I'd picked it up again before leaving the library. Couldn't help myself. It was in my pocket, warm and insistent. It wanted to be used. It wanted to teach. By evening, I was pacing. My mind kept circling back to those equations on the board. Not chemistry, not physics. Something else. Something that used mathematical symbols to describe concepts that shouldn't exist. The terrible thing? The truly terrible thing? Parts of it were starting to make sense. I found myself at my kitchen table with a notebook, sketching symbols from memory. The chalk rolled between my fingers, leaving traces of dust that glowed faintly in the lamplight. Just little exercises, I told myself. Just trying to understand, the way an epidemiologist might study a virus. Safely, from a distance. But distance collapsed. The equations pulled me in deeper and deeper. I started to see connections, not just between numbers, but between concepts, between realities. The math was a language, and the language described doors, ways of moving between, methods of existing in multiple states simultaneously. Time moves strangely when you're consumed by an impossible problem. I looked up once, and it was midnight. Looked up again, and dawn was breaking. My notebook was full, pages and pages of equations that hurt to look at. And I was close, so close to understanding. The phone rang, shrill in the morning quiet. Principal Martinez. "Sarah, thank God. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said, but my voice sounded wrong, distant, like I was speaking from the bottom of a well, or from behind a door that hadn't quite opened yet. "Listen, we need you to come in. There's been another incident. Room 237? A pause. "How did you know?" I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because I was looking at my notebook, at the final equation I'd written, and I understood. God help me, I finally understood what Mrs. Blackwood had been trying to teach. What Miss Peterson had seen. What all of them had seen. The universe isn't math. Math is just the shadow cast by something bigger. Something that exists in the spaces between numbers. And if you could balance the equation, if you could solve for x where x equals the impossible, you could step through. Step out of this reality and into... I was standing in room 237. I don't remember driving to school. Don't remember walking through the halls. But there I was, chalk in hand, facing the board that still bore Ms. Peterson's frantic calculations. My calculations now, our calculations. The door was open behind me. I could hear voices. Tom Martinez, other teachers, maybe even police. But they sounded so far away, like echoes from another world, like memories of sound rather than sound itself. "Sarah, step away from the board." I turned. Tom stood in the doorway, hands raised like he was approaching a wild animal. Behind him, I could see others. Margaret Hensley was there, clutching that manila folder. And Jim the janitor who hadn't been mopping at all, who hadn't been there, who had never been there. "You see him too," I said. "Jim, he's one of them, one of the ones who solved it." Tom's face went white. "Sarah, there is no Jim. There hasn't been a janitor named Jim for 20 years. Of course not, because Jim had balanced the equation in 2003. I could see it now, written in the margins of reality. All of them were here. Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Peterson, Jim, and others. So many others. Existing in the spaces between, maintaining the balance, keeping the door from opening too wide. "Someone has to teach the lesson," I said, and my voice harmonized with voices that weren't quite there. "Someone has to show them the truth. Sarah, please." But I was already writing. The chalk moved across the board like it had a will of its own, completing Peterson's work, solving Blackwood's riddle, balancing the impossible equation. And as I wrote, I felt myself becoming less solid, less real, like I was dissolving into the numbers themselves. "The answer," I said, or maybe they said, or maybe we all said together, is that there is no answer. The equation balances because it doesn't. The door opens because it's always been open. We're not gone. We're just elsewhere. I could see Tom's lips moving, probably shouting, but I couldn't hear him anymore. The sound had become mathematics. The light had become probability. And I was becoming something that could exist on both sides of the equation simultaneously. The last thing I saw with human eyes was Tom Martinez sealing the door with duct tape. Always with the duct tape. As if that could keep us in. As if that could keep the truth from spreading. But here's the thing. Here's the beautiful, terrible thing. I'm still here. We're all still here, in room 237. Teaching the lesson that can't be taught. Solving the problem that has no solution. And sometimes, on October mornings when the light hits just right, new teachers find warm chalk on empty desks. They pick it up, feel its weight, its warmth, its promise of impossible knowledge. Most resist. Most throw it away and never think of it again. But some start to wonder, start to calculate, start to see the patterns in the shadows and the math in the madness. And when they do, when they finally balance that beautiful, terrible equation, we're here. Waiting, teaching, our voices joining the chorus that speaks in numbers and exists in the spaces between. The chalk remembers, you see, it always remembers. And it's still warm, still waiting, still teaching. So tell me, have you ever found something you shouldn't have? Something that called to you? Something that promised answers to questions you didn't even know you were asking? Have you ever walked past a classroom and heard whispers that sounded like numbers? Have you ever woken up with chalk dust under your fingernails? Drop a comment below. Share your story. Because I'm curious. How many of you have felt the weight of impossible knowledge in your palm? How many of you have heard the call of room 237? And if you want to hear more true stories from Riverside, stories they don't want you to know, hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell. Because room 237 is just the beginning. There are other rooms, other doors, other equations waiting to be balanced. Class is always in session, somewhere. The lesson never ends. Sweet dreams, if you can still dream in 3 dimensions. Story number 3. I found teeth in my house's insulation. The contractor's face went pale when he pulled his hand out of the wall. Blood dripped from his fingertips, and clutched between them was something that made my stomach turn. A molar, a human molar, still warm. "Ma'am," he whispered, backing away from the hole he'd torn in my bedroom wall. I think you need to call the police." But here's the thing. I already knew what was in those walls. I'd known for 3 days. And the police? They couldn't help me. Not with this. If you're listening to this late at night, maybe tucked under your covers, maybe you should check your walls, just to be sure. Because what I'm about to tell you happened in a perfectly normal house, in a perfectly normal neighborhood in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And if it happened to me, well, let me ask you something first. When was the last time you really listened to your house at night? I mean, really listened. Past the hum of the refrigerator, past the settling of old wood, to the spaces in between? The spaces where things hide? All right, the story's starting now. Get comfortable, but not too comfortable. It started with a smell, not a bad smell exactly, just wrong. Like copper pennies mixed with baby powder. Sweet and metallic at the same time. My husband Jake noticed it first, 3 weeks after we'd moved into our dream home on Maple Street. "Probably just new house smell," I told him, unpacking boxes in what would become our home office. The previous owners had left in a hurry, something about a job transfer to Seattle. They'd practically given us the place. 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, original hardwood floors from 1952. A steal at $220. Jake wrinkled his nose. "New house smell is paint and carpet, Sarah. This is..." He paused, searching for words. "This is something else." I should have listened. God, I should have listened. But we were riding high on new homeowner excitement. First house, first mortgage, first chance to really build something together. I was pregnant, 8 weeks along, though we hadn't told anyone yet. Everything felt like a beginning. The smell got stronger over the next few days. Concentrated in our bedroom, especially near the north wall where our bed pressed against 100-year-old plaster. Jake wanted to call someone, but I kept putting it off. We'd just spent everything on the down payment. How much would it cost to tear into walls chasing phantoms? Then came the scratching. Middle of the night, soft at first. Like mice in the walls, I told myself. Old houses have mice. It's normal, natural, nothing to lose sleep over. Scratch, scratch, scratch. But mice don't scratch in patterns. Mice don't tap out rhythms that almost sound like Morse code. And mice definitely don't stop the second you sit up in bed, heart hammering, straining to hear. "You hear that?" Jake whispered one night, his hand finding mine under the covers. "Yeah." My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Maybe we should call someone, tomorrow, first thing." Tomorrow came with sunshine and birdsong and all the things that make night fears seem silly. Jake left for his shift at the hospital. He's a nurse, works 3/12s, and I convinced myself we were being paranoid. New house jitters, everyone gets them. I spent the day painting the nursery, soft yellow, gender neutral. We'd find out what we were having next month. The smell was fainter up there, almost pleasant. I lost myself in the repetitive motion of the roller, up and down, up and down. That's when I heard it. Not scratching this time. Breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from inside the wall, right where I was painting. The roller slipped from my hand, splattering yellow across the drop cloth. I pressed my ear to the wall, holding my breath. Silence. "Hello?" The word came out as barely a whisper. Nothing. I backed away, paint on my hands, my heart doing things hearts shouldn't do. Rational brain kicked in. Air in the pipes. House settling. Acoustic tricks old houses play. But I didn't go back to painting. I went downstairs, made tea with shaking hands, and called Jake. "We need someone to look at the walls," I said when he answered. "Today. What happened?" I almost told him about the breathing, almost, but how do you say that without sounding crazy? The smell's getting worse, and I think there might be something dead in there, a raccoon, or I'll call someone on my break. You okay? You sound, I'm fine, just pregnancy hormones, probably. We both knew I was lying. The contractor came that evening. Bill Murphy, Murphy & Sons Construction. Thick Boston accent even though he'd lived in Iowa 20 years. Red-faced, confident, the kind of guy who'd seen everything houses could throw at you. Until he saw our wall. He started with a stud finder, tapping along the plaster, making marks with a pencil. Normal stuff. Then he paused, frowned, ran the finder over the same spot again. That's weird, he muttered. What's weird? Jake asked. We were hovering behind him like nervous parents. Usually got 16 inches between studs, standard spacing, but here, he tapped the wall. It's all over the place, like someone built around something. My stomach dropped. Around what? Bill shrugged. Only one way to find out. You want me to open her up? Jake and I exchanged glances. We'd come this far. Do it, Jake said. Bill cut a neat square in the plaster, about 2 feet by 2 feet. The smell hit us immediately. Stronger, sweeter. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Jake gagged. I covered my nose with my shirt. Jesus, Bill muttered, shining his flashlight into the hole. What the hell? He reached in, felt around. His expression changed from confusion to disgust to fear? There's something. He pulled his hand back, and that's when we saw the blood. Fresh blood coating his fingers, and clutched between them. A tooth, a human molar, yellowed with age, but unmistakably real. Bill dropped it like it burned. The tooth hit the floor with a sound that shouldn't have been so loud, but it echoed in that room like a gunshot. Ma'am, he said, that Boston accent thick with fear. I think you need to call the police. But I was already shaking my head because I'd seen something he hadn't, something that made calling the police pointless. The tooth was still warm, still had a pink nerve attached. And from deep in the wall, so soft only I could hear it, came the sound of someone crying. The police came. Of course they came. 2 officers, both younger than me, trying to look professional while clearly thinking we were crazy. They bagged the tooth, took photos of the wall, asked questions that went nowhere. Previous owners say anything about renovations? Officer Chen asked, notebook out. They barely said anything, I admitted. Just that they needed to leave quickly. New job. And you didn't think that was suspicious? Jake's jaw tightened. In this market, we were lucky to get the place. The officers exchanged glances. I knew that look. Over-eager homebuyers spooked by their first fixer-upper. They promised to run tests on the tooth, check missing persons reports, all the official things that meant nothing would happen. After they left, Bill refused to touch the wall again. I've been in construction 30 years, he said, packing up his tools. Never seen nothing like that. You want my advice? Get a priest. We're not religious, Jake said. Bill paused at the door. Might want to reconsider. That night, neither of us slept. We lay in bed, staring at the hole in our wall like it might start breathing. The smell was overwhelming now. Sweet rot and copper and something else. Something alive. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started again. But now we could see where it was coming from. The insulation, pink and fluffy and ordinary, was moving, pulsing, like something was pushing through from the other side. We're leaving, Jake said, already throwing clothes in a bag. Hotel, now. I wanted to argue. This was our house, our dream. Our future nursery was right upstairs, half-painted, waiting. Then I saw what was pushing through the insulation. Fingers, small, child-sized fingers, gray with decay but moving, searching, trying to find purchase on our side of the wall. We ran. The Holiday Inn downtown had rooms available. The night clerk didn't ask why we showed up at 3:47 a.m. with bags thrown together and fear in our eyes. Maybe she saw it a lot. Maybe Cedar Rapids had more secrets than I'd thought. "We can't go back there," I said, sitting on the polyester bedspread while Jake paced. "We have to. Our stuff, the mortgage, Jake." I grabbed his hand, placed it on my stomach. "We have bigger things to worry about." He sank down beside me. "What do we do?" I didn't know, but I knew someone who might. The next morning, I called my grandmother in Des Moines. Nana had lived through things, seen things. If anyone would believe us. "Sarah, honey," she said, after I'd stumbled through the story. "What's your address there?" I told her. The silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Nana, get out." Her voice was sharp, urgent. "Get out of that house and don't go back." "We did. We're at a hotel, but no. Get out of Cedar Rapids. Come here now." "Nana, what are you—" "That house." She was crying. I'd never heard my grandmother cry. "I know that house. Oh, Sarah, why didn't you tell me where you'd moved?" My blood ran cold. "You know our house? 1247 Maple Street?" She laughed, but it was bitter, broken. Everyone knew that house, back in the 60s. The Jacobson place. What happened there? "Just come here, please. I'll tell you everything, but you need to be away from there when I do." We drove to Des Moines in silence. Jake kept checking the rearview mirror like something might be following us. I kept my hand on my stomach, feeling for movement that was still weeks away from coming. Nana's house smelled like lavender and coffee. Safe smells. Real smells. She hugged us both, held me extra long, then sat us down at her kitchen table with tea we didn't touch. "The Jacobsons moved to Maple Street in 1962, she began, hands wrapped around her own mug. "Young couple, just like you. David was a dentist. Martha was pregnant with their first." I felt Jake's hand find mine under the table. Everything was fine at first. Then Martha started complaining about sounds in the walls. David thought it was mice, but Martha, she said it sounded like chewing, like something was eating the house from the inside. The tooth, that damned tooth. David didn't believe her, not until their baby was born. Nana's voice dropped. "The baby, it came out wrong, too many teeth, rows and rows of them like a shark. It didn't cry, it just smiled." "That's not possible," Jake said, but his voice shook. Nana continued like he hadn't spoken. "Martha went mad, said the house had infected her baby. David tried to keep it quiet, but people talk. Then children started disappearing. One here, one there, always near Maple Street." "What happened to them?" I whispered. "They found them, eventually, what was left." She met my eyes. "In the walls, Sarah. They found them in the walls, but not all at once. Pieces. Sorted. Organized, teeth in one section, fingers in another. Like someone was collecting. The fingers pushing through our insulation. God. The police never proved anything. But David and Martha left town one night and never came back. The house sat empty for years. Then new people would move in, stay a few months, leave. Always the same story. Sounds in the walls. That smell. And sometimes..." She paused. "Sometimes they'd find things. Fresh things. Like whatever was in those walls was still active. That's why the previous owners left," I said. "It wasn't a question. Probably. The question is, why didn't they warn you?" I thought about the rushed closing, the avoided eye contact, the price too good to be true. They'd known. They'd known, and they'd let us walk right into it. There's more, Nana said, about what happens to pregnant women in that house, what it does to the babies. My hand went to my stomach. No, the house. It changes them inside, makes them compatible with whatever's in the walls. We're not going back, Jake said firmly. We'll stay here, figure out. It's too late for that. Nana's eyes were so sad. Once you've slept there, breathed that air, it's in you, the house, it marks you, claims you. That's insane, Jake said, but I was already feeling it. That sweet metallic taste in the back of my throat, the way my teeth suddenly felt loose in my gums. There's only one way to break it, Nana said. You have to go back, face whatever's in those walls, finish what the Jacobsons started. Which was? She pulled out an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline made my blood freeze. Dentist attempts to burn down family home, claims it must be purified. He tried to destroy it, she said. But the house, it wouldn't burn. Fire department said it was the strangest thing. Flames just died, like the house was swallowing them. I stared at the grainy photo under the headline. David Jacobson being led away in handcuffs, his face twisted in desperation. Behind him, 1247 Maple Street stood untouched, windows dark, waiting. So what do we do? I asked. Nana reached across the table, gripped both our hands. You feed it what it wants, or it feeds on you. What does it want? She looked at my stomach and I knew. God help me, I knew. Not my baby, I whispered. Never. Then you better figure out what else it's hungry for. And fast. She squeezed our hands tighter. Because once it gets a taste, it doesn't stop eating. We lasted 3 days at Nana's before the dreams started. Not nightmares. That would have been better. These were invitations. The walls of our bedroom opening like curtains, revealing spaces that shouldn't exist. Rooms upon rooms stretching back into darkness, filled with things sorted and stacked. A library of bones. A gallery of skin, and in the center, something massive and patient and hungry, waiting for us to come home. We have to go back, I told Jake after the third night. We were both gray-faced, exhausted. The taste in my mouth had gotten worse. Sweet metal and decay. Sarah, look at me. I pulled my lips back, showed him my gums. They were bleeding, receding. My teeth felt like foreign objects. It's already happening. He checked his own mouth in the mirror, went pale. His were starting too. What about the baby? I pressed my hand to my stomach. Still firm, still normal, but for how long? That's why we have to go now, while we still can. Nana packed us supplies like we were going to war. Salt, iron filings. Her mother's Bible, even though we didn't believe. Belief doesn't matter, she said. Intent does. And sometimes, she pressed a small leather bag into my hand. Sometimes you need older things, older protections. What is it? Teeth, she said simply. My grandmother's. Pulled them all out when she was 30. Said it was the only way to keep certain things from getting in. Keep them with you. I wanted to laugh, wanted to cry. Instead, I pocketed the bag of ancient teeth and tried not to think about the irony. The drive back to Cedar Rapids felt like sinking into dark water. The closer we got, the heavier the air became. By the time we turned onto Maple Street, I could barely breathe. Our house looked normal from the outside. Suburban, safe. The lie of it made me angry. Ready? Jake asked, parking in our driveway. No, me neither. We went in anyway. The smell hit us like a physical thing. Stronger now, mixed with something else. Something burning. The hole Bill had cut in our bedroom wall had grown. Not physically larger, but deeper, like looking into a throat. And there was sound coming from it. Not scratching, chewing. Wet, rhythmic chewing. "Hello, house," I said, feeling insane. "We're home." The chewing stopped. Then, from deep in the walls came a sound that raised every hair on my body. Laughter. Children's laughter. But wrong. Too many voices, overlapping, some high and sweet, others gurgling through fluid. "What do you want?" Jake shouted at the walls. The laughter stopped. Then, clear as day, a child's voice. "To finish growing." I grabbed Jake's arm. "Did you—" "Yeah." "Growing into what?" I asked the wall. Silence, then, "Into everything." The wall began to bulge. Not quickly, but steadily, like something huge was pressing against it from inside. Plaster cracked, paint peeled, and through the cracks we could see movement. Pink insulation pulsing like lung tissue. "The other rooms," Jake said suddenly. "We need to check the other rooms." We ran through our house, throwing open doors. The guest bedroom wall was bulging too. The bathroom, the kitchen, every room, the walls breathing, expanding, like the house was one giant organ preparing to birth something terrible. In what would have been the nursery, we found the worst thing. The wall had split open completely. Inside, nestled in the insulation like some horrible womb, was a shape. Small, fetal, but wrong. Too many joints, too many teeth, and it was moving. "Oh God," Jake breathed. "Is that—" "One of the missing children," I finished. But changed, transformed, becoming part of the house itself. It opened eyes that were still horrifyingly human and looked right at us. "Almost ready," it whispered through too many teeth. "Almost time to play." I thought of our baby, of what this house wanted to do to it. To us. Rage flooded through me, hot and clean. "No," I said. "No, you don't get to have us." I pulled out Nana's bag of teeth, not knowing what I was doing, only that I had to do something. The moment they touched air, the house screamed. Every wall, every surface vibrating with fury. The thing in the nursery wall hissed, retreating deeper into the insulation. "Those don't belong here. Neither do you." I scattered the teeth across the floor. Where they landed, the walls recoiled, plaster bubbling like burned skin. "Sarah!" Jake pointed at the ceiling. Cracks were spreading, widening. Through them, we could see into the attic. But it wasn't our attic. It was vast, cathedral high, filled with hanging things I didn't want to identify. "We need to find the source," I said. "Whatever started this." "The basement," Jake said. "Has to be." We'd avoided the basement since moving in. Told ourselves we'd clean it out eventually. Now, standing at the top of those stairs looking down into darkness that seemed too thick, too alive, I understood why. The stairs creaked under our weight. The smell down here was different, older, chemical. Jake found the light switch. What we saw made us both step back. The basement walls weren't covered in insulation. They were covered in dental equipment. Antique chairs bolted to the walls at impossible angles, drills hanging like mechanical spiders, and everywhere, jars. Hundreds of jars filled with teeth. Baby teeth, adult teeth, wisdom teeth, all floating in yellow fluid, all perfectly preserved. "The Jacobson collection," I whispered. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room was a dental chair, and in the chair, God, in the chair, it had been human once. Maybe. Hard to tell now. The thing was more mouth than body, jaws distended impossibly wide, lined with rows of teeth that spiraled down its throat like a nautilus shell. Its arms had fused to the chair, skin and leather becoming one. But its eyes were still aware, still suffering. David Jacobson, Jake breathed. He never left. He became this. The thing's eyes focused on us. Its mouths began to work, trying to form words through all those teeth. Tried to stop it. Each word was agony. Fed it myself instead of them. The children, I said. You were trying to save the children. Something like relief flickered in those ancient eyes. Not enough, never enough, hungry, so hungry. What does it want? Jake demanded. What is it? Growth, evolution, becoming. The thing that had been David Jacobson shuddered. Started with one tooth found in ground when building. Not human, not anything, just hunger. One tooth, one impossible tooth that had infected the ground, the house, everything built on it. Spreading like a virus, turning the house into what? A mouth, a stomach, a womb for something that should never be born. How do we stop it? I asked. Those eyes focused on my stomach. Feed it something else, something stronger. I understood. Horrible, perfect understanding. The teeth, I said. Nana's teeth. They're not infected, they're pure. Jake caught on. If we feed it those... Poison, David gurgled. Yes, poison. It kill the growth. The house shuddered around us, responding to the threat. The jars on the walls began to crack, yellow fluid seeping out. The teeth inside chattered like wind-up toys. Do it, David begged. Please, let me die. I pulled out Nana's bag, heavier now, like it knew what was coming. The house groaned, walls pressing in. Here, Jake pointed to David's mouth. The center of the spiral, the source. I upended the bag. My grandmother's teeth fell like seeds into that horrible maw. The effect was immediate. David convulsed, back arching impossibly. The chair shook, bolts straining, and from his throat came a sound. Not quite scream, not quite retch, but something between. Black fluid poured from between all those teeth, smoking where it hit the floor. The house went insane. Walls buckled. Ceiling cracked. The jars exploded one by one, teeth flying like shrapnel. We ran for the stairs as the basement collapsed behind us, David's final scream following us up. The main floor was chaos. Every wall was convulsing, things falling out. Bones, hair, toys, all the remnants of lives the house had digested. The thing in the nursery wall was shrieking, trying to pull itself free before the house died around it. Out, Jake yelled, pulling me toward the door. But I stopped, had to, because I could feel it, the house's death throes. And in them, all those children. All those souls trapped in the walls, finally free. Thank you, whispered a chorus of young voices. Thank you for finishing it. Then we were outside, stumbling across our lawn as our dream home collapsed. Not burning, dissolving, melting like a tooth in acid, taking with it all the horror it had contained. When it was over, nothing remained but a perfectly rectangular pit where our house had stood. No debris, no foundation, just clean, empty earth, like it had never been there at all. The official story was a gas leak. Catastrophic failure. Total loss. Insurance paid out without asking too many questions. Turned out we weren't the first owners to file that particular claim. Officer Chen called once to follow up about the tooth, but when I told him it had been destroyed in the explosion, he seemed relieved. Probably for the best, he said, and hung up. We stayed with Nana while looking for a new place. I was terrified for the baby, checking my mouth every morning, waiting for signs the infection had taken hold. But my teeth firmed up. The bleeding stopped, The sweet metal taste faded. At my next ultrasound, the technician frowned at the screen. "What?" I gripped Jake's hand. "What's wrong?" "Nothing wrong," she said slowly. "Just, have you had dental work recently?" "Why?" She turned the screen toward us. "Your baby has the most perfect teeth I've ever seen in a fetus. Usually they don't calcify this clearly until much later. But they're beautiful, like little pearls." I started crying. Jake held me. The technician, misunderstanding, assured us it was nothing to worry about. Healthy teeth were a good sign, a blessing really. We found an apartment on the other side of Cedar Rapids. New construction. No history. The first night there, I lay awake listening. Just the normal sounds of a normal building. No scratching, no breathing, no chewing in the walls. But sometimes in the early morning hours, I swear I hear it. Not from our walls, but from somewhere else. Other houses. Other walls. That wet, rhythmic sound of something feeding, growing, waiting. I did research, found reports going back decades all over the country. Houses that eat, walls that grow things, and always, it starts the same way. Someone finds a tooth. Just one tooth in the wrong place. Maybe while gardening, maybe during renovation. Maybe it's been there for years, waiting, and they brush it off, throw it away, never knowing they've just fed the first bite to something ancient and patient and endlessly hungry. So let me ask you again, and this is important. Have you checked your walls lately? Really checked? Because the thing is, what happened to us in Cedar Rapids? It wasn't unique, wasn't isolated. It's happening right now, in houses just like yours, in walls just like yours. Listen, do you hear that? That sound like something chewing, something growing, something smiling in the dark with too many teeth? Maybe it's nothing, maybe it's mice, maybe it's the house settling, or maybe, just maybe, you should call someone. Tomorrow, first thing, before it's too late. Before you find what's growing in your walls. Sweet dreams, if you can still have them. And hey, if this story kept you up, if you're lying there right now listening to your house in a whole new way, leave a comment. Tell me what you hear. Share this with someone who lives alone, someone who needs to check their walls. Because the more people who know, the more people who check, the better chance we have of catching these things before they fully grow, before they finish becoming. Subscribe if you want to hear more true stories about the things that hide in plain sight, about the houses that hunger, about the walls that wait. I'll be here, listening to my own walls, making sure they stay quiet, making sure nothing's growing. And remember, it always starts with just one tooth. One impossible tooth in an impossible place. Check your walls. Please, just check your walls. Story number 4. They say curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back. Right? That's what I kept telling myself as I stared at my grandfather's journal. The pages yellowed and brittle like autumn leaves. The entry from October 15th, 1987, was circled 3 times in red ink. Found it again today. The staircase. Counted 13 steps this time. Yesterday it was 12. Tomorrow, God help me if there's a 14th. Now, before I dive into what happened next, I need you to do something for me. Check your surroundings. Are you alone? Good, keep it that way. And if you hear footsteps while listening to this, even if they sound like they're coming from inside your own home, don't investigate. Just trust me on this one. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories like this. Because what I'm about to tell you, it's going to change how you look at every staircase you'll ever see again. The story begins now. My name is Jake Morrison, and 3 weeks ago, I inherited my grandfather's cabin in the Adirondacks. Not the touristy part where families rent lakeside cottages and roast marshmallows. No, this was deep in the forgotten corners of upstate New York, where cell service dies and the nearest neighbor is a 40-minute drive through winding dirt roads. Grandpa Earl had been eccentric. That's what Mom always said, though the word she used when she'd had a few glasses of wine was crazy. He'd moved out to those woods in '85 right after Grandma died and slowly cut ties with everyone. Mom tried visiting a few times a year, dragging me along when I was younger, but those visits always felt wrong. I remember being 8 years old, playing in the yard, while Mom and Grandpa argued inside. I'd found this perfect climbing tree, an old oak with branches that formed natural steps. I was halfway up when Grandpa burst out of the cabin, his face purple with rage. "Get down from there, now!" He'd yanked me so hard my shoulder hurt for days. "Don't you ever climb anything around here. You understand me, boy." I'd cried. Mom had yelled. We left early and didn't go back for 2 years. Now, 20 years later, I stood in that same yard, holding the keys to the cabin and a box of Grandpa's belongings the lawyer had given me. The October air bit through my flannel shirt, that particular northeastern cold that creeps into your bones and makes a home there. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered. Log walls darkened with age, green metal roof spotted with rust, windows that reflected the forest like empty eyes. But it was mine now. Free real estate in this economy? I wasn't about to question my good fortune. I spent the first day cleaning, sweeping out dead leaves, checking for rodent damage, making a list of repairs. Normal stuff. The weird things didn't start until I found the journals. Grandpa had kept dozens of them, all stored in a trunk in the attic, leather-bound, organized by year, filled with his cramped handwriting. Most entries were mundane: weather reports, wildlife sightings, grocery lists. But starting in 1987, something changed. The entries became focused, obsessive, all about something he called the structure. October 3rd, 1987. Saw it again while checking the Eastern Trail. Moss-covered, but the steps are clean. Always clean. October 9th, 1987. Tried to photograph it. Film came out black, every frame. October 12th, 1987. It's not in the same place. I marked the trees. It moves. And then, that circled entry about counting 13 steps. I sat on the attic floor, surrounded by journals, as the sun set through the dusty window. Every rational part of my brain said Grandpa had dementia, or maybe carbon monoxide poisoning from an old heater. But the detail in his notes, the sketches he'd drawn, the fear that bled through every word, I had to find out what he'd seen. The next morning, I packed a backpack with water, snacks, my phone, useless for calls but the camera still worked, and Grandpa's journal from 1987. I also threw in the old Polaroid camera I'd found in his desk, the same one he'd tried to use. Call it sentimental. The Eastern Trail started behind the tool shed, marked by a faded yellow blaze on a pine tree. I'd hiked plenty of trails in the Catskills and Adirondacks, but this one felt different, older, like the forest had grudgingly allowed it to exist, but was slowly reclaiming it. Pine needles muffled my footsteps. The air smelled of decomposition and damp earth, that fertile rot smell that forests wear like perfume. Every 100 feet or so, I'd spot another yellow blaze, though some trees had grown around them, warping the marks into elongated smears. I'd been walking for maybe 40 minutes when I noticed the silence. If you've never experienced true forest silence, it's hard to describe. It's not peaceful, it's oppressive. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no wind through leaves. Even my footsteps seemed muted, like the sound was being absorbed before it could travel. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Some old foundation, maybe. Remnants of a fire tower. But as I got closer, the excuses crumbled like old stone steps. It was a staircase. in the middle of the woods, going nowhere. 13 stone steps rising from the forest floor, ending in empty air. No structure above or around them, no ruins nearby, just stairs. The stones were white granite, stark against the brown leaves and green moss. And Grandpa was right. They were clean. Impossibly clean. No leaves, no dirt, no bird droppings, like someone had just finished polishing them. I stood there for I don't know how long, just staring. My rational mind scrambled for explanations while my instincts screamed at me to run. But I didn't run. I took out my phone and snapped a photo. The screen showed only black. I tried again. Black. The Polaroid camera? The photo slid out, and I watched it develop into nothing. Pure black. My hands were shaking now, but I couldn't look away from those steps. They were beautiful in a way that hurt to process. Too perfect, too deliberate, too wrong for this place. The edges were sharp, unworn by weather or time. Each step was exactly the same height, the same depth, mathematical precision in a world of chaos. I found myself moving closer, and that's when I noticed the sound. Have you ever held a seashell to your ear? That hollow, breathing sound that's supposedly the ocean, but is really just your own blood rushing. It was like that, but external, coming from the stairs themselves. A rhythmic whisper that might have been wind or might have been breathing. I jerked back so fast I tripped over a root, landing hard on my ass in the leaves. The impact knocked sense back into me. Whatever this was, Grandpa had spent years documenting it, growing more terrified with each entry. I wasn't about to become the next cautionary tale. I practically ran back to the cabin, branches whipping at my face, that breathing sound following me until I couldn't tell if it was real or just my panicked imagination. Only when I burst out of the tree line did it finally stop. That night, I dove deeper into the journals. Grandpa's obsession made more sense now, and was more terrifying for it. He'd first found the stairs in September 1907, just wandering the property he'd owned for 2 years. But here's the thing. He'd walked that eastern trail dozens of times before. The stairs hadn't been there. They'd just appeared. Over the following months, he documented everything. The stairs moved, never in the same spot twice, but always somewhere on his property. Sometimes they faced north, sometimes east. Once, he found them in a clearing he'd personally cleared the year before, a space that had been empty dirt 12 hours earlier. But the worst part was the counting. See, when he first found them, there were 12 steps. He was sure of it. He'd counted multiple times, even drawn sketches. 12 steps to nowhere, but a week later, 13. The entry I'd seen circled in red. October 22nd, 1987. 14 steps. God help me. There are 14 now. I can see the new one, a slightly lighter stone, like it's younger than the others. What happens when it reaches the top? What's it climbing toward? The entries became sporadic after that. Weeks of nothing. Then frantic scribblings about dreams. Climbing endless stairs, always one more step appearing just as he thought he'd reached the top. He stopped going into the woods. Stopped leaving the cabin much at all. The final entry in that journal was December 3rd, 1987. Heard them last night. Footsteps on stone, climbing. But the stairs are half a mile away, aren't they? I need to check. I need to count. But I'm afraid of what number I'll find. The next journal didn't start until March 1988. No explanation for the gap, just a brief note. Back from the hospital. Doctor says stress. Need to avoid the eastern property. Thinking of selling. But he never sold. Never left. Spent the next 35 years in these woods with those impossible stairs. And now they were mine. I didn't sleep that night. Every settling of the old cabin became footsteps. Every whisper of wind sounded like breathing. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and made coffee, sitting at Grandpa's kitchen table with his journals spread before me like tarot cards revealing a terrible future. The later journals were different. Less frantic documentation, more rules. Guidelines he'd developed over decades of coexistence with something he couldn't explain. Rule 1. Never count the steps aloud. Rule 2. Never touch them with bare skin. Rule 3. Never visit during a full moon. Rule 4. If you hear footsteps, don't look for the source. Rule 5. If someone is on the stairs, do not speak to them. That last one made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. Someone on the stairs? He'd never mentioned seeing people before. I flipped through pages looking for more context and found it in a 93 entry. Saw him again today. Same man as last time, tall, wearing that old-style suit like something from the 40s. He was on step 7, just standing there facing up. I watched for 20 minutes. He never moved, never breathed that I could see. When I looked away to check my watch and looked back, Step 8, I ran. Jesus Christ. More entries over the years. Different people. A woman in a wedding dress, a child in pajamas. That entry was heavily underlined with "no, no, no" written in the margins. A park ranger whose uniform looked decades out of date. Always on the stairs. Always facing up. Always climbing when no one was watching. Grandpa had theories. Dimensional rifts, time loops, purgatory. But his final conclusion, written in shaky handwriting in 2018, was simpler. It's a trap. Don't know what for or why, but it's a trap. The stairs want to be climbed. The people, I think they gave in. Now they can't leave. Step by step, forever. When they reach the top, they start at the bottom again. I've seen the same woman in white 6 times now. She's always on step 3 first time I saw her. I closed the journal and rubbed my eyes. The rational part of me wanted to pack up and leave. List the cabin as is. Let some other poor bastard deal with whatever this was. But another part, the part that kept me up reading horror stories as a kid, the part that always had to check the basement even when I knew better, that part was fascinated. Besides, I reasoned, Grandpa had lived here for 35 years after finding the stairs. Whatever they were, they couldn't be immediately dangerous. Just follow his rules. Document from a distance. Don't engage. I'd study them like he did. Safely, scientifically. God, I was an idiot. The sun rose gray and weak through heavy clouds. October in the Adirondacks isn't known for cheerful weather, but this felt more oppressive than usual, like the sky was pressing down, trying to squeeze something out of the earth. I waited until full daylight before heading out. Packed the same supplies as yesterday, plus a few additions. Work gloves, Rule 2, a measuring tape, and a compass. I also brought Grandpa's .308 rifle. Not that I thought bullets would help against whatever this was, but the weight of it made me feel better. The yellow blazes led me true, though I noticed something odd. They seemed fresher than yesterday, brighter, like someone had touched them up overnight. But that was impossible. I was alone out here, wasn't I? The forest felt different in the gray morning. Less actively malevolent, more waiting, like it was holding its breath to see what I'd do. Even my footsteps seemed tentative, testing each placement before committing my weight. I smelled them before I saw them. Stone has a scent when it's wet, mineral and cold and ancient. But this was stone that had never known rain. Too clean, too pure, wrong. The stairs had moved. Yesterday they'd been in a small clearing surrounded by pine and birch. Today they rose from a grove of massive oaks, their bases buried in twisted roots. If I hadn't known better, I'd have sworn they'd been there for centuries. The way the trees grew around them, accommodating their presence like ordained sacred space. I approached slowly, noting every detail. Still 13 steps. Wait. I counted again, 14. My grandfather's words echoed. God help me if there's a 14th. The new step was at the bottom, pushing the others up, and it was lighter, just as Grandpa had described. The white granite looking freshly carved compared to the weathered perfection of the others. How long before it matched? Before another appeared? I started documenting. Photos still came out black, but I sketched what I saw, took measurements. Each step was exactly 18 inches deep, 7 inches high. Perfect building code compliance in the middle of nowhere. The compass spun lazily when I held it near the stairs, unable to find magnetic north. That's when I noticed the carving. Small, easy to miss unless you were looking at just the right angle. On the side of the 7th step, letters worn but readable. EM 1943. My blood went cold. Earl Morrison, my grandfather. 1943 would have made him, what, 18? But he'd said he first found the stairs in 1987. I circled the structure, looking for more carvings, and found them. Dozens. Names and dates going back over a century. JP, 1897, ML, 1924, SK, 1961. All on different steps like some kind of supernatural guest book. But Grandpa's name on step 7. I thought about the man in the old-style suit, standing on step 7. Never moving unless unobserved. No, 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 no. The breathing sound started again, stronger than yesterday. Not wind, not imagination. Rhythmic inhalations and exhalations, perfectly timed, like someone climbing stairs. I backed away, fighting every instinct that told me to run. Running felt like prey behavior, like it would trigger something. Instead, I walked backwards, keeping my eyes on those impossible steps until the trees swallowed them from view. But even after I couldn't see them, I could hear it. That steady breathing, following me through the forest, always just behind, never quite catching up. It wasn't until I reached the cabin and slammed the door that it finally, mercifully stopped. I spent the rest of that day poring over Grandpa's journals with new eyes. The carving changed everything. He'd known about the stairs long before 1987, but how? Why lie in his journals? Unless he hadn't been lying, unless he truly didn't remember. I found my answer in a storage box in the basement, filled with photo albums and family documents. Pictures of Grandpa as a young man, fresh out of high school, working at a logging camp in, the Adirondacks, 1943. There he was in black and white, standing with a crew of burly men in front of a stack of timber. Mountains in the background. The same mountains I could see from the cabin window. On the back, in faded pencil, Earl's Crew, Timber Survey, October 1943. Lost 2 men to the stairs. Moving camp tomorrow. Lost 2 men to the stairs. I dug deeper. Found a letter from Grandpa to Grandma, dated November 1943. Dearest Catherine, the strangest thing happened last month. We found something in the woods that shouldn't exist. Tom and Miguel went to investigate and I can't explain it. They're gone, but not gone. We see them sometimes, still climbing. The foreman says it's been here since before the first settlements. Says the indigenous folks knew to avoid it. I've decided not to think about it. When I get home, I'm going to forget this place exists. Going to marry you and live a normal life and never, ever come back to these woods. All my love, Earl. But he had come back. 42 years later, he'd bought property in the exact same area. Like something had called him home. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about patterns. The stairs moved, but stayed on the property. They grew by 1 step at irregular intervals. People who investigated too closely ended up on them, climbing forever. And those who escaped, like Grandpa, seemed drawn back eventually. Was I already caught? Had I been doomed the moment I inherited this place? Or was there still a chance to break free? I made a decision. I'd go back one more time, in full daylight, and map exactly where the stairs appeared. Find the boundaries. Maybe there was a pattern to their movement, something Grandpa had missed. If I could predict where they'd be, I could avoid them. Section off that part of the property. Build a fence. Something. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Frost sparkled on the grass like broken glass, and my breath came in clouds as I loaded my backpack. I'd found surveying equipment in the shed, flags, spray paint, a GPS unit that might or might not work under the canopy. This time, I didn't follow the eastern trail. I bushwhacked straight north from the cabin, marking trees as I went. The plan was to create a grid, systematically search each section, and map any sign of the stairs or their previous locations. For 3 hours, it worked. I found traces, clearings where nothing grew, perfect circles of bare earth, spots where the trees bent away, as if avoiding something. I marked each one, slowly building a picture of the stairs' territory. Then I heard the humming. It was a woman's voice, low and sweet, humming something that might have been a lullaby. The sound drifted through the trees like smoke, impossible to pinpoint. I froze, hand on my rifle, remembering Rule 5. If someone is on the stairs, do not speak to them. The humming got closer. I could make out the tune now. Amazing grace, but slower, sadder, like a funeral dirge. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of white. The woman in the wedding dress, she stood on the stairs. Of course they were there, right in my path, right where they hadn't been 5 minutes ago. Step 3, just like Grandpa had written. Her dress was pristine despite decades of exposure. Her veil perfectly arranged. She faced upward, toward nothing, humming that broken hymn. I should have backed away. Should have followed the rules. But I had to know. Hello? My voice cracked like a teenager's. The humming stopped. She didn't turn, didn't move, but I felt her attention shift to me like a physical weight. The forest held its breath. Can you hear me? I stepped closer, staying off to the side, careful not to touch the stairs. Nothing. Then, so soft I almost missed it. Help? The word didn't come from her mouth. It came from the stairs themselves, vibrating up through the stone like a tuning fork. More voices joined it, a whispered chorus. Help us. Can't stop climbing. Please. The top isn't there. Always one more step. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a root. As I fell, I saw her move. Just a fraction, just enough. When I hit the ground and looked up, she was on step 4. The voices grew louder, overlapping, desperate. Don't count them. Don't touch. Run. That last voice was different, familiar, male. Grandpa? I scrambled to my feet and ran. Behind me, the voices rose to a wail that might have been wind through stone, or might have been dozens of souls trapped in an endless climb. I didn't look back. Didn't stop until I burst out of the tree line and collapsed on the cabin's porch, gasping. When I finally caught my breath and turned around, I could see them. The stairs. They'd followed me to the edge of the forest, standing just inside the tree line like a predator testing boundaries. 14 white steps gleaming in the afternoon sun. No, 15. The new step was already darkening, aging decades in minutes. And at the very top, so faint I might have imagined it, a figure stood silhouetted against the sky. Tall. Male. Wearing what looked like a park ranger's uniform. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a warning. Then he took a step up, into empty air, and vanished. Only to reappear at the bottom, starting his climb again. I barricaded myself in the cabin that night, moved Grandpa's heavy desk in front of the door, checked every window lock twice, kept all the lights on. Not that any of it would matter if those things could just appear wherever they wanted. But the illusion of safety was all I had. The journals became my Bible. I read obsessively, looking for any clue about how to escape this. Grandpa had tried leaving once, in 1994. Made it all the way to Albany before the dreams started. Climbing, always climbing. Each step taking him further from the waking world. He'd driven back in a fugue state, waking up in the cabin 3 days later with no memory of the return trip. Others had tried too. I found newspaper clippings tucked into the journals. Local hiker missing for 3rd week. Search called off for Burlington woman. Mysterious structure in woods claims another victim. All from different decades, all describing people who'd encountered the stairs and either vanished or returned, changed. There was one story that stood out. 1962. A geology professor from Syracuse had come to study the stairs after hearing local legends. He'd spent weeks taking samples, making measurements, trying to understand their composition. Then he'd had an idea. If the stairs wanted to be climbed, what if someone climbed them properly? Not like the trapped souls, moving without will, but consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of what they were doing. His theory was that the stairs were incomplete. They were trying to reach something. Heaven, another dimension, who knew? But they couldn't do it alone. They needed someone to willingly walk their length and... The article cut off there, torn away, but Grandpa had written a note in the margin. He made it to the top, saw him myself, stepped off into nothing and kept climbing, like there were invisible steps. Went up and up until I couldn't see him anymore. Never came back down. The stairs had 16 steps before he climbed. After, back to 12. Like they reset, like they fed on him and started over. Fed, reset, started over. I looked out the window at the tree line. Even in the dark, I could see them. A pale smudge against the black. Waiting, patient as stone. That's when I understood. The stairs weren't just a trap. They were a cycle. A cosmic reset button that needed human will to activate. Every person who climbed them added to their power. Let them grow another step, reach a little higher. But eventually, someone would complete the circuit. Climb beyond the physical stairs into whatever lay above. And then reset. Back to 12 steps, ready to start again. How many cycles had there been? How many times had they reached toward their goal, only to begin anew? And why here? Why this spot in the endless Adirondack wilderness? My phone buzzed. The first signal I'd gotten since arriving. A text from my mom. Haven't heard from you in days. Everything okay at Dad's place? I stared at the message. How could I possibly explain? Hey, Mom. Grandpa's cabin came with supernatural stairs that eat people. Instead, I typed, all good. Just dealing with some property stuff. Might need to stay longer than expected. Her response was immediate. Be careful up there. Dad always said those woods were tricky. Tricky, yeah, that was one word for it. I dozed off around dawn, still sitting at the table, head pillowed on Grandpa's journals. The dream came immediately. I was climbing. Not the white stone stairs, but wooden ones, endless and spiraling. Each step creaked under my weight, threatening to break. But I couldn't stop. Below me was nothing but darkness. Above, a faint light that never got closer no matter how many steps I took. Almost there, a voice said. I looked up to see Grandpa, young again, in his 1940s logging clothes. He stood on a landing that hadn't been there moments before. Just a few more steps, Jake. I can't, I gasped. My legs burned. My chest felt like it might explode. "Sure you can." He smiled, but his eyes were sad. "We all climb eventually. It's what they're for, what we're for. Food for their journey. Journey where?" He pointed up at the light. "Wherever they're trying to go. They can't do it alone, see? Need us to power the engine, step by step by step." He started to fade. I held out so long, but they're patient. They'll wait forever if they have to. "Grandpa, wait!" But he was gone, and I was still climbing. The stairs beneath me turned from wood to stone, white and perfect. I looked down and saw others below me, the woman in white, the man in the suit, dozens of climbers locked in their eternal ascent. And at the very bottom, starting his first step, was me. I woke, gasping. The journal stuck to my cheek with drool. Sunset painted the cabin walls bloody. I'd slept the entire day. Outside, night was falling, and with it came the sounds. Footsteps on stone, dozens of them, all perfectly synchronized. Climb, step, the rhythm of a heartbeat, of breathing, of inevitable forward motion. I stood on shaking legs and walked to the window. The stairs had moved closer, much closer. They stood just 20 feet from the cabin, glowing faintly in the dusk, and they were full. Every step held a person. Men, women, children. God, the children were the worst. All in clothes from different eras, all facing upward, all perfectly still until... Step. They all moved at once up one stair. The person at the top stepped into nothing and vanished, only to appear at the bottom, beginning again. An endless loop of human souls powering an engine I couldn't understand, and at the very top, waiting his turn to step into oblivion, stood my grandfather. He looked exactly as he had in my dream. Young, strong, wearing those 1940s logging clothes. He turned his head, the only one who could, and looked directly at me. His lips moved, no sound, but I could read the words, "Your turn." The stairs pulsed, their light growing brighter, calling, inviting, promising an end to questions, to fear, to the terrible burden of choice. All I had to do was walk outside, put my foot on that first step, join the cycle. It would be so easy. No. I slammed my palm against the window, the pain shocking me back to myself. The cursed things were in my head, wearing my grandfather's face, using my love for him against me. The real Earl Morrison had fought this for decades. He wouldn't want me to give in now. But what choice did I have? I couldn't leave. They'd follow me in dreams. Couldn't stay. They were getting bolder, closer, stronger. Couldn't destroy them. They were older than human memory. Unless... I thought about the professor from 1962. He'd climbed them properly, reached the top and kept going, breaking the cycle, resetting the count. What if that was the key? Not avoiding them, not fighting them, but completing their purpose. What if someone climbed them, knowing it was a one-way trip? A sacrifice to buy time, to reset the clock and give the next generation a chance to figure out a permanent solution. Grandpa had bought me 20 years. Maybe I could buy someone else 50. I spent the next hour writing, filling a fresh journal with everything I'd learned, every rule, every pattern. I included maps, sketches, theories. Then I sealed it in a waterproof bag along with Grandpa's journals and hid them in the cabin's root cellar. Someone would find them eventually. Someone smarter than me, maybe. Someone who could break the cycle for good. I wrote a note for my mom, told her I loved her, told her to sell the cabin and never look back, told her not to come looking for me. Then I loaded the rifle, not because I thought it would help, but because the weight was comforting, strapped on my headlamp. Took one last look around the cabin that had been my grandfather's prison and my inheritance, and walked outside to face the stairs. They hummed with anticipation. The climbers remained frozen, waiting. Even the forest held its breath. I approached slowly, my boots crunching on frost. Up close, the stairs were even more beautiful than I'd realized. The stone wasn't just white, it held veins of silver and gold that caught the light like stars. Each step was a work of art, a masterpiece of engineering, a perfect trap. "All right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let's do this properly." I put my foot on the first step and woke up in my apartment in Albany. Sunlight streamed through windows I recognized. My roommate's music thumped through the walls. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my mom and a date 3 weeks after I'd inherited the cabin. I sat up, head spinning. Dream? Mental breakdown? Carbon monoxide poisoning like I'd originally suspected? Then I saw my boots by the door, caked with Adirondack mud. The rifle propped in the corner. My jacket hanging on its hook, pockets full of the surveying flags I'd used. Real. It had all been real. I called my mom, made excuses about bad cell reception. Let her lecture me about communication. Promised to visit soon. Normal conversation. Normal life. Like the last 3 weeks had been erased. Except, that night I dreamed of climbing. And the next night, and the next. Each dream more vivid, more insistent. I ignored them, threw myself into work, into social life, into anything that kept me exhausted enough to sleep without dreams. It worked for a while. Weeks passed, then months. The dreams faded to occasional nightmares. I convinced myself I'd escaped, that whatever grip the stairs had on my family had been broken by my refusal to climb. Until last week, I was hiking with friends in the Catskills. Normal day trip, easy trail. We'd stopped for lunch when I saw them. Yellow blazes on a tree. Fresh, bright, impossible. "Hey," one of my friends called. "Check this out. There's some kind of structure over here." My blood turned to ice. "Don't," I started, but he was already pushing through the trees, already calling back in wonder. "It's like stairs in the middle of nowhere. How cool is that?" I ran after him, branches tearing at my clothes. Found him standing at the base of 13 white stone steps that rose from the forest floor into nothing. No, not 13, 16. They'd grown, fed on someone else while I'd been gone. 3 new steps, 3 new souls added to their endless climb. And at the very top, my grandfather stood there, young and strong, wearing those same logging clothes. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood the professor from 1962, the woman in white, the man in the suit, all of them looking down at me with sad, knowing eyes. "Jake?" My friend was already reaching for the first step. "You okay? You look like you've seen a... Don't touch them!" I grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "We need to leave, now!" But even as I dragged him away, even as I made excuses about unstable structures and private property, I knew the truth. The stairs had found me, would always find me. The dreams would get worse. The compulsion would grow. And eventually, inevitably, I would climb. Just like Grandpa. Just like all the others. It's been a week since that hike. The dreams come every night now. I wake up exhausted, my legs aching like I've been climbing for hours. Sometimes I find myself dressed, standing at my apartment door at 3 a.m., car keys in hand. So far, I've resisted, but I can feel my will eroding like stone in water. Each night, the pull gets stronger. Each dream, more vivid. Which brings me to why I'm sharing this story. I need you to know. Need someone to remember. Because I don't think I have much time left. The stairs are patient, but they're also hungry. And they've marked me as theirs. If you ever inherit property in the deep woods, if you ever find stairs where no stairs should be, don't investigate. Don't take photos. Don't even count the steps. Just leave. Leave and never look back. And if you hear footsteps in your dreams, Climbing, always climbing. Wake yourself up. Whatever it takes. Because once you start climbing in your sleep, you're already lost. My grandfather fought them for 35 years. I've managed 6 months. Maybe the next person will do better. Maybe they'll find a way to break the cycle for good. Or maybe they'll just be another step in an endless staircase, climbing toward a destination that doesn't exist. I guess I'll find out soon enough. Because tonight, I'm going back to the cabin, back to the woods, back to the stairs, not because I want to, but because I can't stay away any longer. They're calling, and I'm so tired of fighting. If you're listening to this, if you're safe in your bed, far from any mysterious structures in the woods, count yourself lucky. Hit subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. Share it with someone who loves a good scare. But remember, some stairs are meant to be climbed, and some should be left alone, forever. The sound you're hearing, that's not static in the recording. That's footsteps, stone on stone, getting closer, always getting closer. I have to go now. They're